Can you be pro-choice and a Christian? Absolutely. And Jesus is the reason why. A woman's right to choose and her freedom of access to contraceptive care has been a debate in Christianity for longer than I've been alive. In this election season in particular, I've had a lot of parishioners who have been told you can't be a Christian and be pro-choice. That is just factually incorrect. And it also implies that some people have not been reading their Bible. You see, in the ELCA, we are a gospel-centered tradition. That means that we choose to read the Bible and the scriptures through the lens of the gospel. And when you are reading the gospel, you have to recognize that there are two commands, only two, that Jesus gives us. Love God, love your neighbor. You may be asking yourself, well, what does that have to do with this issue of a woman's right to choose? Well, let me tell you a few things about Jesus and the law. In Matthew chapter 5, Jesus tells us that he has not come to overturn the law, but to fulfill the law. In this way, he kind of gives us a little bit of a guide on how to live into the commandments of love that he gives us. And what he's basically saying is the laws of the Hebrew Bible are good, as long as we are living into them in a way that is loving, as long as we are being critical in our thinking in how we apply those laws. If we are applying God's laws in a way that hurt other people, then we are most likely not living into the will of God. Jesus was never a fan of interpreting the laws literally. He was never a fan of religious dogmatism, and we see this in the gospel. In Mark chapter 3, he condemns Pharisees for basically telling him he can't heal people during the Sabbath. And in John chapter 9, he condemns the Pharisees for being too strict in their interpretation of generational sin, and condemning a blind man for sins that he never committed in his own life. In Mark chapter 7, Jesus tells the Pharisees that it's not what you eat that causes you to sin, it's what comes out of your mouth that is sinful. And time after time after time, we see Jesus telling his disciples that if you take the law too literally, it will lead you into a path of sin. And this relates to the issue of a woman's right to choose, because being pro-choice is not necessarily being pro-abortion. And from a Christian perspective, believing that a woman should have the right to make decisions about what happens to her own body is a matter of love. Jesus gives us permission to think critically about what God's love should look like within the world. And if we are living into God's command in a way that hurts people, Jesus tells us to consider whether or not we are actually doing the will of God, because we're definitely not doing the will of Christ. When a woman has to choose whether or not she has to get an abortion, that is a tough decision. It's a decision that I, as a man, would never really understand. And as a Christian, one can absolutely believe that a woman should have the right to make that decision on her own. That is absolutely a loving and Christ-centered position to take on this issue. And anybody who tells you that you are not a Christian for doing so probably has not read their Bible.